In this section, we're going to look at Angular Material, which is a collection of components that give our applications a modern look and feel. More specifically, you're going to learn how to work with various kinds of components, such as form controls, icons, dialog boxes, progress spinners, tooltips, and so on. You're going to learn how to use the pre-built themes, as well as create a custom theme. You're also going to learn how to use Angular Materials typography and create custom typography for your applications. This section is fairly long, so it's best to watch it over a few sessions. Now, let's get started. So what is Angular Material? Angular Material is a library of reusable and high-quality UI components that are built with Angular and TypeScript. These components are internationalized, so users with different languages can use them. They have a clean and simple API. They're well tested with unit and integration tests. They're customizable, they're very fast and have minimal performance overhead, and they are almost well documented. So let me show you a few examples of these components in action. If you head over to material.angular.io, you can see the homepage for Angular Material. Here under components, you can see we have various kinds of components. We have form controls like radio buttons, checkboxes, and so on. We have navigation components like toolbars, menus. We have layout components like lists, cards, grids. We've got buttons, indicators, and icons, pop-ups and modals, and data table. So let me show you a few of these in action. The first one I want to show you is under form controls. So here, let's go to this checkbox. So here on the examples tab, you can see these checkboxes and radio buttons in action. So these checkboxes have the same API as the native checkboxes we have used so far, but you can see they look very pretty. And they also have some nice animation. See that? So very nice. Now we can easily add these to our applications by using Angular Material. Let's take a look at another example. So back to the components page. This time I'm going to show you a modal. So under pop-ups and modals, let's take a look at the dialog. Once again, under the examples tab. So here we have a button, launch dialog. And when we click this, we get a dialog with a nice animation. One more time. See, it has a very nice animation. Now, a question that you might have is that we already have the concept of dialogues in Bootstrap. So why should we use this dialog in Angular Material? Well, Bootstrap and Angular Material, as you know, they are two different libraries built by different teams. Bootstrap was built a few years ago using plain old JavaScript, and it has nothing to do with Angular. So all that JavaScript code that we have in Bootstrap libraries, we cannot easily use them in our Angular applications. We need to create custom directives or custom components and do some magic in order to use those components. Angular Material, on the other hand, is built specifically for Angular applications. So we don't have to do anything magical. We can simply import a module and use Angular Material components just like how we use our custom components. Also, in terms of the aesthetics, Bootstrap has a different design language. All the Bootstrap components have a different look and feel. Whereas the Angular Material is based on the Material Design, which is a visual language developed by Google in 2014. This is the same language that you see in Google+, in Android, and many other applications. So to answer your question, you can use Bootstrap, you can use Angular Material, or you can use both. Angular Material is still new. It doesn't have all the components that we have in Bootstrap. So if you want to build an application with a complex user interface, chances are some of the components that you need may not currently be part of Angular Material. So then you might have to use Bootstrap. But as I told you before, because we cannot use Bootstrap JavaScript easily in our Angular applications, we have to use third-party components that are based on Bootstrap. And that means our application is going to have a lot of dependencies to libraries built by others. And these libraries can break at any time. So that's why I personally prefer Angular Material, because all these components are built with the same list of quality standards, They have a common API, they're well tested, and we can easily use them in our Angular applications. So, enough theory. Next, we're going to install Angular Material in our project. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to install Angular Material. Now, before we get started, I just want to let you know that you don't have to memorize any of the steps I'm going to show you in this lecture. All of these are perfectly documented, but you might find it easier to watch the video first and then look at the documentation. So, in the future, you can always go to material.angular.io. Under this guides page, you'll find this guide, Getting Started. And this shows you all the steps that you need to follow in order to add Angular Material to a project. So now let me show you these steps in action. First, in the terminal, just like the previous sections, I'm going to create a new project using Angular CLI. So ng new material-demo. All right, beautiful. Now let's go to this folder, material-demo. Here we need to install a couple of node packages. So npm install --save. The first one is Angular/CDK, and this stands for Component Development Kit. This Component Development Kit is one of the dependencies of Angular Material, and it's basically a library that allows you to build awesome components for the web, but without adopting the Material Design visual language. So if you want to build a reusable data table that doesn't necessarily have the Material Design visual language, you can build it with CDK in an agnostic way. So this is the first dependency we need to install. And the second one is the actual Angular Material package. So at Angular/material. So these are the essential packages that we need to install. Now, optionally, we can install a couple more packages. One is for adding animations, the other is for gesture. So if you want to have those nice animations, also install at Angular/animations. And finally, in order to add gesture support, you need to install Hammer.js. So Hammer.js. So Hammer.js is a powerful library that allows you to add gesture support to your pages. For example, you may tap with your finger, or swipe, or rotate, and so on. Now, once again, this is an optional dependency, but I recommend you to add it to your application to make it more accessible. All right, now let's install these dependencies. All right, so the first step was to install these dependencies. Next, we need to include a theme. So let's go to Visual Studio Code. Here under Node Modules, under @Angular, you can find the material folder. And here we have these pre-built themes. So we have a bunch of themes. They're beautiful. The one I'm going to use is Indigo-Pink, but you may use any other that you prefer. So let's go to styles.css. We need to import a theme, just the same way we imported Bootstrap before. So @import. And here we add the relative path from Node Modules. So start with a tilde @Angular/material/indigo-pink.css. Make sure to spell it properly, otherwise it's not going to work. So this was our second step. And now the final step. We need to go to app.module. Here, if you want to add animation support, you need to import browser animations module. Otherwise, you need to import no-op animations module. So let me show you. So if you previously installed Angular animations, you need to import browser animations module from @Angular/platform-browser/animations. Okay, so this is the implementation of the animations module in a browser. Now, if you don't want to have animations, instead of browser animations module, you need to import no-op animations module. So I'm going to select this line, duplicate, and change this module to no-op animations module. So now we need to import one of these modules into our ng module. So here in the imports array, I'm going to add browser animations module. So these are the 3 steps that we need to follow in order to install Angular Material. Now, to make sure that we have installed Angular Material properly, let's go ahead and add a checkbox to our app component. So let's go to app.html. I'm going to delete all the markup here and add a checkbox. So that's md-checkbox. Now let's give it a label, subscribe to newsletter. So in Angular Material, we have a custom component for rendering a checkbox, and this md-checkbox is the selector for that component. Now, back in the terminal, we need to serve this application. Okay, it's ready. So back in the browser, we get a blank screen. So let's take a look at the console. We see a familiar error. md-checkbox is not a known element. Because we have used a custom component, but we have not imported this component into our app module. So let's go to app.module. Every component in Angular Material is defined in a separate module. So we need to go on the top, import this module here, and then add it to the imports array of our ng module. But how do we know what module a component is defining? Very easy. We go to material.angular.io, components, form controls, checkbox. Now under API, you can see the name of the module in which this component is defined. So this component is defined in md-checkbox module. I'm going to simply copy this line back here, paste it. Let's reformat it. Okay. And finally add it to the imports array. md-checkbox module. Save. Back in the browser. All right, now we have a beautiful modern checkbox with animation. So over the rest of this section, we're going to explore each of these components in more detail. All right, now let's continue with this checkbox we added in the last lecture. So this checkbox component in Angular Material implements a very similar API to the native checkbox we have in HTML5. For example, in HTML5, in order to add a checkbox, we need to use input with the type checkbox. Okay? Now here we have a bunch of attributes like checked. We can set it to checked. We have value. We have the change event and so on. So our custom checkbox in Angular Material also has these properties. So once again, if you go back to the documentation for this component, under the APIs tab, you can find all the properties implemented in this component. So here under directives, you can see the name of our component, that is md checkbox. And below that, we have a table with a list of all the input and output properties. Now, there is not enough time to go through each of these properties, and it's really pointless. So I want to show you a few key properties that you're going to use in a lot of real-world applications. So back here, I'm going to delete this native HTML5 checkbox. Now, here's our md checkbox. Here we can set the value exactly the same way of a native checkbox, or we can use property binding. We can bind this to a field or a property in our component. Similarly, we have the checked property. We can set this to checked. To check this by default, let's have a look. Back in the browser. So now our checkbox is checked by default. Or we can use property binding and bind this to a field or property in our component. So let's go to app.component. Here I'm going to define a field called isChecked and set it to true. Now back in the template, I can bind this checked property to isChecked. Save, back in the browser. So we can see it's checked by default. We also have the change event that we can subscribe to. So let's bind this to onChange method in our component. And here we can pass the event object. Now let's go ahead and implement this method in our component. So back here, I'm going to add this onChange method. And for now, simply log something in the console. Back in the browser. So click this. Now look at the console. So this is our event object. It has two properties: source, which references our MD checkbox class, and checked. So here's our MD checkbox. You can see all these properties implemented in this component. Now let's say we have some content here. Let's say we have a div, and this checkbox acts as a toggle to show or hide that div. For example, we can change this label to show details. Here I'm going to add a div, and in this div we're going to have some details. Okay. Now when the checkbox is checked, this div should be visible. So here we can use ng if. Now here in this expression, we need to reference our checkbox. So we can simply give it a template variable. Let's call this show details. And here we can reference show details dot checked property. Okay, so back in the browser. Okay, you can see our details div is initially visible. If I uncheck this, it's gone. So this is how we work with Angular material checkboxes. Another component that is very similar to a checkbox is the radio button. So back in the Angular material website, under components page, let's go to form controls and look at this radio button. So as a quick tip, whenever you want to work with a component, look at this overview tab. Here you should see a very simple example of using that component. So here's our radio button. Now if you click this, view source, you can see the markup that you need to write to render this component. So here we have two elements, MD radio group and MD radio button. So we can put all these radio buttons inside a group, and in that group, only one radio button will be selectable. And of course, we can have multiple groups on a web page. So back in VS Code, I'm going to delete this checkbox here. Instead, we need MD-radio-group. And inside this, we need two radio buttons, MD-radio-button times 2. Beautiful. Now here we can give each button a label, like male and female. We can give them a value. We can hardcode the value here, or use property binding syntax and bind this to a field or property in our component. Now, similarly, I'm going to set a value here. We also have all those properties you learned about in the last lecture. So we have checked. We can hardcode this here, or use property binding and bind this to isChecked field in our component. Save, back in the browser. We got a blank screen. So let's take a look at the console. Now this error is a little bit distracting. It says can't bind to checked since it isn't a known property of MD radio button. Unfortunately, the errors in Angular material are still a little bit immature. So what's going on here? Back in the code, I'm going to temporarily delete this bit of code. Save, back in the browser. We don't have any errors anymore, but if you look at the web page, you don't see the radio buttons. The reason for this is because we didn't import the module for this radio button. Now technically, I expect to see an error like MD radio group is not a known element. But we don't get that error. It turns out that there is something common between the checkbox and the radio modules. So because in app module, we imported this MD checkbox module, we don't get that error saying that this radio group or radio button is not a known element. If I comment this out, see what happens. Back in the browser. Okay, now we got a blank screen. And if you look in the console, you see the error I was talking about. So MD radio button is not a known element. So here's the lesson. Whenever you want to use a component, make sure to import its module first. So back in the documentation for the radio button, look at the API tab. Here's the module that we need to import, MD radio module. So back in the app module, I'm going to import another module from Angular/material. That is MD radio module. And then let's add a line break here. Okay. So then in the imports array, we're going to have the checkbox module and the radio module. Now, something I need to clarify here. In this demo, I'm not using a checkbox. So technically, we should not import this MD checkbox module. But I'm deliberately leaving this here because later I want to show you a technique to refactor our code. So we imported our radio module. Now, back in the browser, these are our beautiful radio buttons. So now back in the app component, I was going to use this property binding here to automatically check the female radio button. Let's test this. Back in the browser. So we can see female is checked by default. Now, if you look at the documentation for this radio button, here we can see the MD radio group class or MD radio group component. Here we have an input property called value. So we can set the value of the group, and this will automatically check the radio button with that value. For example, back here, I'm going to remove this checked property. So the value of the female radio button is 0. I can set the value of the group to 0, and this will automatically check the female radio button. And once again, the female radio button is checked. So you can see these components in Angular material are very easy to use. All right, now let me show you how to render a drop-down list. So once again, on the Angular material website, under the components page, let's go to form controls and then select. Just like always, we go to the API tab first and find the module in which this component is defined. So that is MD select module. So before going any further, let's import this module into our app module. So here in the imports array, I'm going to add MD select module and then import this with my auto import plugin. Okay, good. Now back in the documentation, let's go to the overview tab and look at an example of the basic markup we need to render a drop-down list. So here we have two new elements. One is MD-select and the other is MD-option. These elements are very similar to the native select and option elements we have in HTML5. So back in app.component.html, let's add a native HTML5 dropdown list and then convert it to an Angular material dropdown list. So we add select, and inside this, we need one or more options. We don't need the name and ID attributes. And here this option, we want to render it based on a list, based on an array of items. So let's go to our app.component. I'm going to delete all the code here and declare an array of colors like this. Each color is an object with two properties, ID and name. So we've got red and then green and blue. And of course, let's change these IDs. Beautiful. So back in the template, here we're going to apply the ngFor directive to repeat these options. So let color of colors. Now for the value, I'm going to use the property binding syntax and bind this to color.id. And here we can render the label. So color.name. So this is our native HTML5 dropdown list. Back in the browser, we get this ugly, really traditional looking dropdown list. We can do better. So let's convert this to an Angular material dropdown list. Back here, all we have to do is to prefix these elements with md-. So I put the cursor here, Command and D on Mac or Control D on Windows to trigger multi-cursor editing. So Command and D, the first select is selected. One more time, now both select elements are selected. So we type md-select and press escape. Now one more time, this time I'm going to rename option. So Command and D, one more time, and then type md-option. Save, back in the browser. And now we have this modern drop-down list. That's much better. Now, if you want to pre-select one of the items here, you need to use the ngModel directive. So back here, I'm going to apply the ngModel directive on our md-select element. So ngModel, and bind this to, let's say, a field called color. Now back in app.component, I'm going to define this color field here and set it to 2. So I want green to be selected by default. Now if we go back in the browser, we're going to see an error. So we have a blank screen. Let's take a look at the console. All right, can't bind to ngModel since it isn't a known property of md-select. You have seen this error earlier in the course. The reason for this is because ngModel directive is defined in the Forms module. And because this is a brand new Angular project, we have not imported the Forms module. So back in app module, in the imports array, I'm going to add Forms module. Save, and back in the browser. All right, now you can see green is selected by default. So to convert a native HTML5 dropdown list to an Angular material one, all we have to do is to prefix these elements with md-. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to work with Angular material input controls. So back in the Angular material website, on the components page, let's go to form controls and then input. Just like always, first we start with the API tab to find the module. So this component is defined in md input module. Now back in our app module, in the imports array, I'm going to import md input module and then import this with my auto import plugin. Okay, now back in the documentation, let's go to the overview tab and look at a sample example. So this is how the input controls of Angular material look like. Instead of having the label before an input field, we have a placeholder that is currently on top of the input field. So if I delete sushi here, look, the placeholder is now bigger and more visible. And when we click it, it kind of jumps to the top. So this is a very nice modern effect that you have probably seen in a lot of applications out there. Now let's take a look at the markup. So here we have a new element that is md input container. And inside this element, we have a native HTML5 input element. Now this input element has a directive that is md input. Now you might ask why we need a container here. The reason for this is because in Angular material, we have a few other elements here. For example, we can have a hint below each input field. We can have a prefix, a suffix, we can have error messages. So we put all these inside a container. So back in VS Code, let's go to our app component.html. I'm going to delete all this and start with md input container. Now here we need an input of type text, and we should decorate this with md input directive. We should also give it a placeholder. So placeholder, let's say username. Now back in the browser. So this is what we get. Okay. Now let's take this to the next level. We can have a hint below this input field. So we have a new element that is md hint. And here we can say something like type a unique username. Back in the browser. And this is our hint. Okay. We can also add a suffix here. For example, let's add a span. And here we can have something like @domain.com. So imagine in this form, the user is going to select a username, and this username combined with @domain.com is going to make up their email address. Now, here we can apply a directive on this span that is md suffix. Let's take a look. So here's our suffix. We can add mosh.hamedani@domain.com. We can also have a prefix. So I'm going to duplicate this line and change md suffix to md prefix. And here we can have something like admin dot. Now back in the browser. So we have admin dot mosh-hamedani@domain.com. So this suffix is always there. We cannot delete it. Okay. Now we can also add error messages here. So let's make this input field required. And then here I'm going to add another element that is md-error. Previously in the section about template-driven forms, we used a div with a couple of bootstrap classes to render an error. We used alert and alert-danger. But here when using Angular material, we use md-error. And by the way, make sure not to use bootstrap classes here. For example, earlier when we built our forms, we always added this form-control class to our input fields. You should not add this here because this will mess up with the appearance of your Angular material components. Okay? So you should either use bootstrap or Angular material when you're building a form. So let's delete this. So I added this required attribute to our input field here. And here inside md-error element, I'm going to add an error message. The username field is required. Now let's see what happens. So back in the browser, note this asterisk here. This indicates that this field is required. And when I click it, the asterisk turns red. However, when I tab away, we don't see the error message because we have not applied the ngModel directive on this input field. So there is no form control to keep track of the validity of this input field under the hood. So here's our input field. I'm going to apply the ngModel directive. And also, as a requirement, we should give each input field a name. This is when we are building template-driven forms. Remember that? So let's call this username. Now with these, Angular is going to create a form control object and associate it with this input field. And this form control will keep track of the validity of this input field. So let's see this in action. I put the focus here and then tab away. And here's our error message. Beautiful. So this is how we work with input fields in Angular material. We can give our input fields a hint, a suffix, a prefix, one or more error messages. And by the way, here we want to render this error message only if the field has an error. So technically we should have something like ngIf. We set this to, first we need to declare a template variable. So let's call this username and set it to ngModel. Now with this variable, we can see if our input field has an error or not. So ngIf username dot invalid and username dot errors dot required. And with this, we can have multiple errors of different kind. Exactly the same way we implemented error handling in the template-driven form section. The only difference is in the markup. So instead of using divs with Bootstrap classes, we're using Angular material elements. Okay? So this is all about input fields. What you learned in the last lecture about input fields also applies to text area elements. Let me give you an example. So first I want to render a traditional text area. We don't need the name and ID attributes, so let's delete them. We don't need columns either. And I'm going to set the number of rows to 2. Now back in the browser. So this is what we get, a traditional text area. Now to give this the material design look and feel, first we need to put it inside MD input container and also apply the MD input directive. Now, this is what we get, a modern text area. Now let me show you one more directive that you're going to love. So back in the documentation for MD input, under the API tab, in the list of directives, look, we have this directive, MD text area auto size. So we can apply this directive to a text area, and this will automatically resize that text area to fit its content. So back to our text area, I'm going to apply MD text area auto size. Now, back in the browser, I'm going to type a long text here. See what happens. The text area is expanding to fit its content. In the old days, we had to implement this using vanilla JavaScript or jQuery. But now we can easily achieve this functionality using MD text area auto size directive. Now that you know how input fields work in Angular Material, let's take a look at the date picker component. So here on the Angular Material website, let's go to Form Controls and look at this date picker. First, in the API tab, we can see this is defined in MD date picker module. So here in app module, I'm going to import MD date picker module. Okay. Now back in the documentation, let's take a look at the Overview tab. So here's our date picker. You can click this icon. We get this beautiful date picker. We select the date and it's displayed here. So now let's take a look at the markup. This may look a little bit complicated at first, but I'm going to break it up. It's very easy. Back in app-component.html, first we need to add an input. So as you learned in the last lecture, we need to put our inputs inside MD input container element. So here we add an input and also apply the MD input directive. Now after this, we need to add a date picker. So MD dash date picker. Now we need to connect this date picker to this input field we created earlier. So first we need to assign a variable here. Let's call this birth date. And then on this input element, we apply MD date picker directive and bind it to this template variable, that is birth date. So this way we linked these two elements, okay? Now it's also common to add an icon, like the icon of a calendar here. So in this input container, we add a button. We want this to be a suffix for our input field. So we apply MD suffix directive. Now we apply another directive, that is MD date picker toggle. And once again, we bind this to this template variable we defined here. So birth date. So this is the basic markup. Let's test this. Back in the browser, we get a blank screen. So let's take a look at the console. No provider found for date adapter. You must import one of the following modules at your application root: MD native date module, or provide a custom implementation. So at the time of recording this video, this date picker module is built on top of the native date object in JavaScript. But currently, the team behind Angular Material is working to add support for moment.js dates. So then in the future, we're going to have another module, and you will be able to choose between native date objects in JavaScript or moment.js dates. So here we need to import MD native date module into our app module. So back in app module, in the imports array, I'm going to add MD native date module and import this from Angular/material. Save, and back in the browser, let's refresh. All right, here's our date picker. So we can click this icon. We get this calendar pop-up. This calendar pop-up has two modes, the months mode and the year mode. So by default, it opens in the months mode. And here you can see, we see all the days of the current month. We can click here to switch to the year mode. So now we are in 2017. We see all the months in this year. And then we can navigate back and forward. It's a beautiful calendar icon. I really like it. So let's select a date. Let's say 3rd of August, and it's displayed in the input field. Now let me show you something. Note that here, we don't see all the days in August because I'm working with a small browser window to simulate a mobile device that doesn't have a lot of real estate. So if you look at this application on a mobile phone, this is not a good user experience. Let me show you how to solve this problem. So back in app component.html, here on our MD date picker element, we need to set touch UI attribute or property, more accurately, to true. Now back in the browser, let's click this again. Now we have a better view. We see more days here, and we can also scroll. So make sure to always set touch UI to true. Now let's take a look at a few other functions of this date picker. By default, if you don't have a date here in this input field, when you click this calendar pop-up opens with the current day selected. So today is 1st of August 2017. If I put a date here, let's say January 3rd, 2017, the calendar pops up with January 3rd of 2017 selected. Now, another thing we can do here is set a range of valid dates. For example, you may want to limit your user to select a date between 1st of January 2017 and let's say 1st of August 2017. So here in app component, we can set the min and max properties of this input element. So, in HTML5, we have min and max. In Angular, we use property binding syntax and bind this to a field or property in our component. So let's go to app.component.ts. I'm going to delete all this code here. Instead, I'm going to define min date and set it to a date object. So note that here we're using a native JavaScript date object. In the future, when we have support for moment.js dates, we can use those kind of objects here. So let's set a date here. Let's say 2017, 1st of January. And similarly, I'm going to define another field, max date, and set this to 1st of August. Now back in our template, I'm going to bind this min property to min date and the max property to max date. Let's see what happens. Now when I click this, technically all the days after the 1st of August should be disabled. But this is currently a bug in the date picker component, and the team behind this is aware of this. They're currently working on it. So hopefully in the next release, this will be fixed. So if you go to September, you can see the 1st of September is enabled, but all the other dates are disabled. So there is a simple bug in how this date picker calculates the min and max dates. Now, another thing that is currently not implemented is displaying an error when the user adds an invalid date. For example, if I type 1234 here or type my name here, we don't get any error messages. Again, this is an issue that Angular Material team are working on. If you want to keep track of this issue on GitHub, head over to github.com/angular/material2/issues/4978. Now let me show you one last thing before we finish this lecture. Sometimes you may want to display the calendar automatically. This is very easy to implement. So let's go back to the documentation for Date Picker. On the API tab, if you scroll down, you can see this Date Picker has a couple of methods, open and close. So we're going to call the open method to open the calendar when the input field gets focus. So back in our template, I'm going to bind the focus event of this input field. And here I'm going to call the open method of our Date Picker. Earlier we defined this template variable here, birth date. So we can use this to reference our Date Picker. Birth date dot open. Like this. Now back in the browser, when I click here, we'll get this calendar. Beautiful. So this is our Date Picker in Angular Material. Currently it has a few bugs and it also lacks a few features. Once again, if you look at the overview tab in the documentation for this component, here you can see the status of this Date Picker. And in the future, when you watch this video, chances are this is going to be different. So in the future releases, the Angular Material team are going to add support for date times. They're also going to add support for displaying date ranges. They're going to add support for custom time zones. They're going to implement infinite scrolling through calendar months and add support for Moment.js dates. In Angular Material, just like Bootstrap, we have a number of beautiful modern icons. So if you head over to material.io/icons, you can see all these icons on this page. So simply scroll down and you can see these icons here. Each icon has a label, and this label is what we're going to use in our markup. We can also search for icons here. For example, I can search for add, and now we can see all icons that have add in their name. So we have add shopping cart, alarm add, note add, and so on. So let me show you how to use icons in our Angular applications. First, head over to material.angular.io, go to the guides page, and then getting started. On this page, when you scroll down, look at step 6, add material icons. In order to render icons, we need to import the material icons font from googleapis.com. So I want you to copy this URL. I can either add this as a link element on index.html, but there is a more elegant way. So back in VS Code, let's go to styles.css. Here we're going to add an import statement. So import, double quotes, and then paste the address. That's better. Next, we need to go to the app module and import the icon module. So here in the app module, in the imports array, I'm going to add md icon module. And of course, import this with the auto import plugin. Now let's go to app.component.html. We can add an icon using md-icon element. And here we add the name of our icon. Here's an example. So we want to render this icon on our web page. Look at this label here, add alert. So here I'm going to type add alert. Now, because we have two words here, we need to replace this white space with an underline. Otherwise, we're going to get two icons, one for the add icon and the other for the alert icon. Now let's take a look at the result. And here's our icon. Now, if you want to change the color of this icon, there are two ways. One simple way is using CSS. Another way is using a custom theme, and that's something we're going to look at later in this section. So for now, let me show you how to use CSS to change the color of this icon. So let's go to app.component.css. Here we can apply a style to our MD-icon element. So we can set the color to purple. Now, of course, this is very generic. So if you have multiple icons on this page, all these icons are going to be purple. If you want to set the color for a specific icon, perhaps you need to use a custom class here, like add-alert or an ID. So for this demo, it doesn't really matter. Now back in the browser, you can see our icon is now purple. So this is how we add an icon. You can see this is easier than working with glyph icons defined in Bootstrap. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to work with buttons. So just like always, we start in app module, and here we import MD button module. And now let's import this with the auto import plugin. Beautiful. Now let's go to app component.html. Here I'm going to add a plain HTML5 button. Let's call this button 1. And with this, we get something like this. Pretty boring and ugly. So let's give this a modern look and feel. In Angular Material, we have a number of directives that we can apply to our buttons to give them the material design look and feel. So the first one is MD-button. Let's have a look. Now, I personally don't like this because it doesn't really look like a button. It looks like text. However, when we hover it, we get this effect, and when we click it, we get this animation. But once again, by default, it doesn't really look like a button, and I personally recommend you not to use this directive. So now let's take a look at another directive. I'm going to duplicate this line. This time I'm going to use MD raised button. And now let's change the label to button 2. And here's the result. This is much better. Okay. Now by default, the background color of this button is based on the background color of our theme. So this theme we have applied here, its background color is white. That's why the background color of this button is white. But we can change this. We can simply apply the color attribute. And here we have 3 options: primary, accent, and warn. If you have worked with Bootstrap, you have seen the same concept there. So in Bootstrap, we have primary, secondary, danger, and so on. So let me set the color of this button to primary, and also change the label to primary. Now let's duplicate this a couple of times. And this time I'm going to use accent, and finally warn. And also let's change the labels accordingly. So these are our 3 beautiful buttons based on the current theme. Now, what if you don't like these colors? What if instead of this blue-purple for the primary button, you want your primary buttons to look green? Well, there are 2 ways to achieve this. One way is to use CSS, but that's something I recommend you not to do, because you want your entire application to have a common and consistent look and feel. If you have that green used in your button, chances are that green should be used somewhere else as well. That's why in Angular Material, we have this concept called theme, where we define all the colors in our application. And that's something we're going to look at later in this section. So for now, don't worry about changing these colors. Just be aware that you can set the color of a button using the color attribute. Now we have another kind of button. So let me duplicate this last line. I'm going to remove the color attribute and change this directive to MD fab. What is fab? Well, I used to think it's fabulous because these buttons are really fabulous, but it actually stands for floatable action button. These are round buttons that have an icon inside. So we don't add a label here. Instead, we add an icon, MD-icon. Let's use the check icon. Now back in the browser. So this is our fab. Now the icon here should actually be white, but it's purple because in the last lecture, I changed the color of our icons to purple. So let's go to app.css. So see, this is why I said you shouldn't apply a style like this, because this is very generic and it can impact various elements in the template for this component. So let's delete this. Now back in the browser. Now our icon is white. Also, just like the raised buttons, you can change the color of fabs using the color attribute. So we can come back to this app component.html and set this color for our fab. Let's change this to primary. And with this, we get this kind of blue-purple button. We have another useful component in Angular material that is called chips. Here's an example. You've probably seen something like this in a lot of applications. We can use these chips as some kind of tags below an object. For example, we can add all the tags below a product, or we can use them to implement some kind of filter. For example, imagine we want to display the list of courses and we have 3 categories: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. The user can click each category to see the courses in that category. So let me show you how to implement something like that. First, in app module, I'm going to import md chips module. Okay. Now let's go to app.component.html. The markup to render a list of chips is like this: md chip list, and inside this we're going to have one or more chips. So md-chip, let's say times 2. And now we give them a label like 1 and 2. So this is what we get: 2 chips with a neutral background. We can mark these chips as selected. So back here, for the first chip, I'm going to set the selected attribute to true. Let's have a look. So this is what we get. You can also change the color of the selected chips. For example, here I can set the color to accent. And now our selected chip is pink. Again, this is based on the current theme, and it can be different on your machine depending on the theme you are using. Now let's make this dynamic. So let's go to app.component.ts. Here I'm going to define an array for our course categories. So categories. For each category, we're going to have an object with one property called name, beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Okay. Now back in the template, instead of hard coding these chips here, we want to render them dynamically. So here we add the ng4 directive, let category of categories, and then use interpolation to render the label, category. Now, when the user clicks a chip, we want that chip to be selected. So we're going to handle the click event. And here we toggle the selected property of this category. So category dot selected, we set it to not category dot selected. And finally, we bind the selected property of this chip to category dot selected. Let's have a look. So I made a mistake. Instead of rendering the name of a category, I'm actually rendering the category object itself. So back here in the interpolation, we should render category.name. And this is what we get. Now, when we click a chip, it becomes selected. Now, with this implementation, we can select multiple categories. But what if only one category should be selected at any point in time? Let me show you how to implement this. It's very easy. So instead of toggling this selected property here, we want to call a method in our component. In that method, first we're going to deselect other categories and then select this category. Okay, so let's call this method select category, and we give it this category object here. Now back in the component, let's implement this method select category, takes a category object. Now here we need to deselect the other categories. So this that categories. First, we want to filter them. We want to find the other categories. So C goes to C, not this category. Okay? So with this filter object, we're going to iterate over our categories array. And for each element, we run this comparison. If that category is not this category we passed here, we're going to return that from this filter. So this gives us the other categories. And then we can iterate over them using this for each method. And for each category, we're going to set the selected property to false. Now, if we set C.selected to false, we get a compilation error because this C object doesn't have the selected property. So we need to use square bracket syntax like this. Okay. Now, finally, we need to toggle the selected property of this category. So category.selected, we simply toggle it like this. All right, let's test this. So I select beginner, now intermediate, now advanced. And if I select advanced one more time, it's deselected and everything else works beautifully. Another useful component that you have seen in a lot of real-world applications is Progress Spinner. So in this lecture, I'm going to show you how to work with this component. So first in App Module, I'm going to import MD Progress Spinner module. Okay. Now, back in app.component.html, I'm going to add MD Progress Spinner. Now, this element has two modes, determinate and indeterminate. We use determinate when we know how long this process is going to take. For example, if we're implementing a file upload, we can keep track of the upload progress. So we can display a progress bar from 0 to 100%. There we use mode determinate. So in this mode, we should also set the value property, let's say 20 or 20%. With this markup, we get something like this. So now let's make this dynamic. I want to simulate a scenario where we can keep track of the progress of an action. So let's go to app.component.ts. Here I'm going to add a constructor. And in this constructor, I'm going to call the native setInterval function in JavaScript. The first argument is a callback. So we pass an arrow function here. And here I'm going to increment the value of a field in this class. Let's declare this field here and call this progress. I'm going to set this to 0. And in this callback function, I'm going to increment this. So this dot progress plus plus. Now, if this dot progress equals 100, you want to stop this timer. So we should call clear interval. Now, as the argument, we need to pass the timer object. So I'm going to define another field here, timer, and set it to the return value of the setInterval function. So this dot timer equals this. And here we can pass this timer object to clear interval function. So this the timer. And finally, as the second argument to setInterval function, I'm going to pass a delay. Let's say a delay of 20 milliseconds. So with this code, every 20 milliseconds, this progress field is going to be incremented until it reaches 100. Now back in our template, instead of hard coding this 20 here, I'm going to bind the value property to the progress field in our component. Now let's see this in action. So we get this beautiful progress bar. Nice. Now this progress spinner element also has another mode that is indeterminate. And that is when we don't know the progress of an action. For example, when we call an API on the server, we don't know how long it's going to take to get the response. So we want to display this spinner until we get the response. In this mode, we don't need to set the value property. Okay, now let's see this in action. So this is the spinner we get while loading a page. Now I want to simulate a call to the backend and teach you how to display a spinner while waiting for the server to respond. So back in app component, I'm going to delete the code in this constructor and also these fields here. So you know that in order to call the server, we use our data service. So that data service is going to be a dependency to this constructor. And in the ng-on-init method, we call that data service to get the data. But in this demo, I don't want to waste time creating a service using dependency injection and dealing with all kinds of details that don't matter for this demo. So I want to simulate a call to the server. So I'm going to define a method here, getCourses. Technically, this method should not be here in this component. It should be part of a service, like a data service. But I don't want to waste time creating that service. So here in the constructor, I'm going to simply call this.getCourses to get all the courses. Now, earlier you learned that in our data service, we return observables. So here in this imaginary method, we want to return an observable, and then in the constructor, we're going to subscribe to that observable. Something like this. So dot subscribe. Imagine we get all the courses, and then we're going to set a field like this. Okay? And of course, it's better to write this code inside the ng-on-init method. So let's move on. Here, I want to return an observable without calling the server. So return observable. Now I'm going to use one of the factory methods called timer. This will return an observable that will emit a value after the given time. For example, after 2000 milliseconds, I want this observable to return a value. This simulates a call to the server that is going to take 2 seconds. Okay? Now let's add this factory method on the top. So you can see our observable is imported from rxjs/observable. Now right after that, I'm going to add import rxjs, add observable /timer. That's the name of our factory method, right? So here in the constructor, when we call this.getCourses, we're going to wait for 2 seconds and then we'll get the result. Now here, there's no result, there is no list of courses, and it doesn't really matter. So I'm going to simplify this arrow function here. Instead, we want to hide the spinner at this point. So first, I'm going to define a field here, is loading, and set this to false initially. Now here in the constructor, just before calling the getCourses method to get the courses from the server, I'm going to set this that is loading to true. And here in the subscribe method, when we get the response, we're going to set is loading to false. So x goes to, and here we add this that is loading, we set this to false. Of course, in a more real world scenario, here we also want to set the courses field in our component. Okay. Now, back in our template, we want to display this spinner only when is loading is true. So ng-if is loading. As simple as that. Now let's test the application. So initially we have this spinner for 2 seconds and now it disappeared. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to add tooltips to your elements. So let's start by importing the tooltip module. So md tooltip module. And now let's import this from angular/material. Beautiful. Now let's go to app component.html. Here I'm going to add a span. This is where we're going to have some text. And when the user hovers over this span, we want to show them a tooltip. So here we apply the md tooltip directive and set it to the actual tooltip. Here is my tooltip. Let's have a look. So hover, and we get this beautiful tooltip with a nice animation. However, you can see that this tooltip is kind of off the screen. It's a little bit close to the edges. Now in this particular demo, this is because I don't have any padding in the body element, and chances are you're not going to have this issue in a real world application. But what I want to show you is that you have control over the position of this tooltip. So once again, on the Angular Material website, on the components page, if you scroll down, under pop-ups and modals, you can find the tooltip. Here in the overview tab, you can see all the positions you can set. So we've got above, below, left, right, and so on. Now, how do we set this position? Well, if you look at the API tab, here you can see all the properties of the MD tooltip directive. So look at this input property, MD tooltip position. You can set this to one of the values you saw on the overview tab. So back here, I'm going to set MD tooltip position to right. Now, when we hover over this text, our tooltip appears on the right side. Beautiful. So you can see with Angular Material, it's very easy to add tooltips to any elements. All we have to do is to apply the MD tooltip directive. If you have worked with Bootstrap, you know that implementing tabs requires some complex markup. But in Angular Material, we can easily add tabs to our application with only 2 elements. Let me show you. So first, in the app module, we need to import MD tabs module. Okay. Now, let's go back to our template. We put all our tabs inside a group. So MD tab group. Inside this group, we're going to have 1 or more tabs. So we add MD-tab. For each tab, we need to set the label attribute. And this is for the tab header. For now, I just want to put an X here, and then I will change it later. Now I want 2 tabs, so times 2. This is what we get. So I'm going to change the label of the first tab to billing and the second to shipping. And here, between the MD tab elements, we add the content of a tab. So content of the billing tab. And similarly, here I'm going to add content of the shipping tab. So you can see this markup is very simple, especially compared to the Bootstrap's markup for rendering tabs. Now, let's have a look at the result. So this is what we get. When we change tab, we get this beautiful animation. Now we have a tiny problem here. The content of our tab is so close to the header. So let's add some padding. I'm going to right click here, inspect. Look at the class of this div. It's mat tab body content. So we can define a CSS rule, apply 20 pixel padding to elements with this class. So let's go to styles.css. I want to apply this rule here so we don't have to repeat this for every component that has a tab. So dot mat tab body content. And here we add padding top 20 pixels. And now our tabs look much cleaner. Beautiful. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to add a dialog to your application. So just like always, we start with app module. And here we import MD dialog module. Okay. Now let's go to our app template. Here I want to add a button. And when the user clicks this button, we're going to open a dialog. So button. I'm also going to apply MD raised button directive. And let's call this open dialog. Now let's handle the click event. So click, you want to bind this to the open dialog method in our component. So let's go to app component.ts. Here I'm going to add the open dialog method. Now how can we open a dialog? It's very easy. First of all, let's imagine this dialog is for editing a course. So somewhere in our application, we need to have a component for editing a course. We can display that component in the router applet as a web page, or we can display it inside a dialog. How we display it doesn't matter, but we need a component to start with. So I'm going to generate a new component here. Let's call this edit-course. All right, so we have a new component. Now, in order to display this component inside a dialog, first we need to inject the MD dialog service in our app component. So here in app component, I'm going to add a constructor. Here we inject an MD dialog object. This is a service defined in the MD dialog module that we use for opening dialogs. So let's import this from Angular/material. Okay. Now here in the open dialog method, we can simply call this the dialog.open, and as the first argument, we specify the target component, that is edit course component. That's all we have to do. Very easy. Let's have a look. Back in the browser, here's our button. Click. Okay, we got this overlay and it looks like there's a dialog on the left side of the screen, but it looks like something is not working. So let's take a look at the console. We got this error here. No component factory found for edit course component. What does this mean? Well, earlier in the course, in the section about deployment, I told you about the compilation step that happens when an Angular application starts. So you know that Angular compiler kicks in, it's going to walk down the tree of our components, and then it will compile each component in this tree. But where does this tree come from? Well, it starts from index.html. So here we have the root component, that is app root. So then Angular compiler is going to look at the template for app root, that is our app.component.html. So here we don't have any references to any other components in this application. In other words, the only component in the component tree is our app component, even though we created this edit course component, but it's not in the component tree. So Angular compiler cannot find it, it cannot compile it, and that's why we got that error. Also, in that section about deployment, I showed you what happens when Angular compiler compiles a component. For each component, it generates an ng factory file. Remember? So that's why we get this error. No component factory found for edit course component. So the reason this happened is because we're adding this edit course component dynamically in the DOM. It's not hard-coded anywhere in our templates. To solve this problem, we need to register this component as an entry component. So here in app module, inside this ng module decorator, we have these properties: declarations, imports, providers, and so on. We can also add another property that we haven't seen so far, that is entry components. And we set this to an array. In this array, we register all the components that are added dynamically. So here we need to register edit course component. Now, back in the browser, the error is gone. And when we click this button, we get this beautiful dialog. We can click on the overlay and the dialog disappears with an animation. Very nice. Now, let's add two buttons here to close this dialog. So let's go to edit course.html. Here I'm going to add a couple of buttons and apply the MD raised button directive on each of them. Let's call the first one yes and the second one no. Now when the user clicks on any of these buttons, we want the dialog to close automatically. How do we do that? It's very easy. There's another directive for this purpose. So if you look at the documentation for the dialog module, on this page under the API tab, if you scroll down, under directives, you can see the MD dialog close directive. Look at the selector. We can apply this as an attribute to the button element. So here, all we have to do is to apply MD dash dialog dash close. Now, optionally, we can set a value here, and this value will be the result of closing this dialog. So if you want to tell the component that opened this dialog what button the user clicked on, we can set the value here. So we can set this to yes. And then I'm going to duplicate this on the other button and set the value to no. Now, just to let you know, back in the documentation, here on this table, you can see the input properties of this MD dialog close directive. So you can see we have an input property with an alias, which is exactly the same as the selector for this directive. So that's why I've set this property like this here. All right, now let's go back to our app component and read the result. So look at the return type of this open method. The return type of this method is an instance of the MD dialog ref class. Note that this class is generic, and inside this angle brackets, we have the type of generic argument. So here we'll get a dialog reference to edit course component. So let's chain a few method calls here. Once we get this dialog reference, dot, we can call the after closed method. Look at the return type of this after closed method. It returns an observable. With this observable, we can subscribe to it and will be notified when the user closes our dialog box. So we call after closed. Now we have an observable, so we can call the subscribe method. And here we get the result. For now, let's simply display it in the console. Okay, now back in the browser. So I'm going to open the dialog and click the yes button. Now look in the console, and this is the result. Beautiful. So to open a dialog, we use the MD dialog service. We simply call the open method, and optionally, if you want to be notified when the dialog is closed, you can subscribe to the observable that is returned from the after closed method. In the next lecture, I'm going to show you how to pass data to a dialog. All right, now that you know how to open and close dialog boxes, let me show you how to pass data to your dialogs. So here back in app component, when opening this edit course component, let's say we want to pass the ID of this course. Passing the data is very easy. Here in the open method, you pass a second argument. In this object, we're going to have a property called data, and we can set this to any values or any objects that we want to pass to our dialog box, to our target component. This can be a simple number, it can be a string, or it can be a complex object. So let's say in this object, we're going to have a property called course ID, and we want to set this to 1. So this is how we pass data to our dialogs. Now on the receiving side, we should be able to read this data. So let's go to edit course component.ts. When the dialog service opens this component in a dialog, it's going to pass our data in the constructor. So here I'm going to add a parameter called data, and this can be called anything. It doesn't have to be data. And the type of this parameter should be any, because we can pass anything here, right? Now, in this demo, I simply want to display this in the console. So data is this data. Now back in the browser, we get this error. Can't resolve all parameters for edit course component. This is an error that you may see from time to time. And basically this has to do with dependency injection. Let me explain why. You know that when our application starts, Angular is going to compile each component in the component tree. In this case, it's going to compile this edit course component. So first it looks at the constructor. It looks at all the parameters we have defined here, and it's going to inject those parameters into this constructor. That's dependency injection, right? Now, if we had, instead of this parameter of type any, if we had something like service of type course service, would we get an error here? No. Let's verify this. So I'm going to generate a service called course service. Okay, beautiful. Now let's go to app.module and register this service as a provider. So here in the providers array, I'm going to add course service. Okay. Now, back in our edit course component, let's import this course service. Beautiful. And also, let's temporarily remove this data. So back in the browser, the error is gone. Beautiful. So if our parameter is of type course service, we don't get that error anymore. Now, let me revert this back to what we had earlier. So data of type any. The reason we got this error earlier is because Angular doesn't know what to inject into this constructor, because any can be anything. So to fix this problem, we need to have a closer look at dependency injection. Let's go back to our app module. Here in the providers array, you have seen two ways to register dependencies. One way is the simple way where we simply add the name of a service here. You have also seen another way using the provider object. So we pass an object with two properties: provide course service, and then use class course service. You have seen this a few times earlier in the course, right? So with this, we're basically telling Angular that whenever we have a parameter in a constructor of a class, and the type of that parameter is course service, use this class. Now, this first way of registering a dependency is basically a short way to the second approach. So to solve the problem with our any parameter, we need to register some kind of dependency here. So I'm going to duplicate this line. Now for this provide property, what should we add here? Any? It doesn't make sense. It's kind of weird. We are telling Angular that whenever the type of a parameter of a constructor of a class is any, use this class. It's kind of weird. And that's why we have this compilation error. So how can we solve this? Well, before I show you how to do this, I want to introduce you to a new term. In Angular, what we have here is referred to as token. This is what we call an injection token. And this injection token determines the type of parameter of a constructor of a class. Now, when dealing with non-class parameters, like when we have a parameter of type number or a string or an interface, we need to create a custom injection token because that type cannot be used as a token. We cannot have number or string or any here. We need to create a custom injection token. So how can we do it? Very easy. Let's go back to our edit course component. So here I want to create a custom injection token for this parameter. So I'm going to export a constant and call it dialog underline data. Because this is a constant, all the letters are uppercase. Now we set this to a new injection token. This class is defined in Angular/core. Look, it's defined in Angular/core. Now, here in the constructor of this class, we need to pass a string that determines the name of this token. So we give it an arbitrary name, like dialog underline data. Now we have an injection token, so we can go back to our app module and use this custom token in our provider object. So back to app module. For the provide, I'm going to use dialog underline data. Now, what should we use for the class? Well, here we don't want to deal with a predefined class because we're dealing with an object that is passed at runtime. So instead of the use class property, we can use value. And here we can pass an actual object. So I'm passing a blank object that doesn't have any properties. Now with this, we're telling Angular that whenever the parameter of a class is marked with this custom injection token, that is dialog underline data, pass this empty object as the value of that parameter during dependency injection. Okay? So the final step is to go back to our edit course component and mark this parameter with our custom injection token. So we have a decorator function that is called inject. This is also defined in Angular/core. Now, as the argument to this decorator function, we need to pass our custom injection token. That is dialog underline data. Now we have a compilation error here looks like my auto import plugin didn't work. So yes, it couldn't add that here. So we should import the inject function from Angular/core. All right. Now let's see if these changes have solved our problem. So back in the browser, okay, the error is gone. Beautiful. Now back in the edit course component, here in the constructor, we want to log this data object in the console. So let's put it back here. Now back in the browser, I'm going to click this button. And now let's take a look at the console. So we have this empty object, and this is the object that we defined during dependency injection. But the purpose of this lecture was to pass some data to our dialog. So earlier in our app component, when opening this dialog, we passed this complex object. So instead of that blank object, we want to get this object here. I explained all this so you know exactly what happens under the hood. In this particular case, we don't really have to define a custom injection token. This is actually defined in the dialog module in Angular material. So let's go to our edit course component. On the top, we don't need to define this custom injection token. Let's delete this line. Now here in the constructor, we're going to inject the injection token that is defined in the dialog module. That is MD underline dialog data. Let's import this from Angular/material. Okay, beautiful. Now finally, let's go back to our app module. So we don't need to register this dialog data anymore, because when we import the MD dialog module, this will automatically register all the dependencies. So there in that module, there is a provider object that associates that custom injection token with a predefined object. Now, one last thing. Further up, we have a reference to this dialog underline data that we just removed. Let's delete this. Beautiful. So now let's test the application. Back in the browser, let's open this dialog and look in the console. Now we have this object that we receive in our dialog. This object has the course ID property set to 1. So here's the lesson. We can pass data to our dialogs using the second argument of the open method of the dialog service. Now on the target component, in this case edit course component, in order to receive that data, we need to add a parameter in our constructor and decorate this parameter with the inject decorator and use MD underline dialog underline data as the custom injection token. As simple as that. Okay, so far we have used a lot of Angular material components. Now, if you take a look at app.module, you can see this imports array is growing. It's getting really fat. And as we use more Angular material components, this array is going to get even worse. So in this lecture, I'm going to show you a technique to refactor this code and make it cleaner and more maintainable. But before we get there, I want to explain what exactly is wrong with this implementation. In software engineering, we have this concept called cohesion. Cohesion means things that are related should be together, and things that are not related, they should not be together. This principle helps us to organize our application code properly. As an analogy, think of a house. In the kitchen, all the objects are highly related. We have plates, glasses, pots, and so on. We don't have a bed in the kitchen, right? Similarly, in the bedroom, we have the bedroom furniture. We don't have our pots in the bedroom. So this is the cohesion principle in the real life. Now, in this implementation, we are missing the cohesion principle. Look at this imports array. All these modules are highly related. These are all about Angular material components for rendering beautiful modern components. So these are highly related. In contrast, we have this forms module, which is completely separate from, let's say, Angular material modules. So to apply the cohesion principle here and organize this code in a better way, we need to put all these Angular material modules inside a new module. So let's say that module is going to be called MD components module. Then it would be better if we had only this module here instead of all these other modules. See, with this change, our imports array would be a lot cleaner and more maintainable. So now let me show you how to create this new module. We're going to use Angular CLI to generate this module, just like how we generate components and services with Angular CLI. So ng g m for module, and now let's call this md-components. So this creates a new folder, md-components, and in this folder we have md-components.module.ts. Now in this implementation, we don't really need to put only this single file inside a folder. So I'm going to take this file out and put it under the app folder. So move source/app/md-components/md-components. We're going to move this to source/app. And now we can delete this directory. So source/app/md-components. Beautiful. Now let's go to md-components module. So you can see we have a class called md-components module. This class, just like our app module, is decorated with the ng-module decorator function. So here we have imports and declarations, exactly like our app module. Now, in this module, we are not going to have any components. We are not going to have any directives, any pipes. So we don't really need this declarations property. Also, because we are not going to have any components, we are not going to have any templates. We're not going to use any directives defined somewhere else. So we don't need this imports array either. Okay. Now we have another property here called exports, which is an array. What we add in this exports array will be exported out of this module. So this means we can move all those Angular material modules here, put them in the exports array, and then when we import this MD components module, all those Angular material modules would automatically come with our new module. So back in app module, I'm going to cut all these material design modules here and move them in the exports array like this. Now, of course, we need to import them all on the top. So I'm going to go back in app module. If you scroll up, you can see this fat import statement for importing all these modules from Angular/material. Let's cut this. Okay. Now back here, let's import them on the top. And by the way, we don't need this common module either because it was referenced in the imports array that we deleted. All right. So now this is our new module. We call this MD components module. All we are doing here is exporting material design modules. With this, we can go to our app module, and in the imports array, we simply import MD components module. We have a compilation error because we have not imported this module on the top. So now our application has better organization. In the imports array, we have those high-level modules like browser module, animations module, forms module, and MD components module. And inside this MD components module, you're referencing a bunch of highly related modules all about Angular material. Throughout this section, you have heard me reference the word theme. In Angular material, we have this concept called theme, which is basically a collection of various color palettes. We have primary, secondary, and warm. Primary refers to a color that appears most frequently in our application. The secondary color is used to give some accent to certain key elements in the UI. We often use it for buttons, progress bars, sliders, for highlighting things, and so on. And we use the warn palette to give warnings to the user. For example, when there is an error in an input field. Here is an example. In this design, the primary color is blue. And note that here we have two different shades of the blue. We have a mid-tone and a darker shade on the top. So this is our primary color. The secondary or the accent color is yellow. And you can see that we have used this here for this button and slider. So this secondary color allows certain elements like buttons and sliders, to stand out. Here's another example. On this page, we have multiple tabs. Again, you can see 3 different shades of our primary color. We have a dark shade, we have a mid-tone, and a light shade. And here again, we have used yellow as our secondary color to highlight the currently selected tab. These palettes help us keep a consistent look in our application. So if in the future we decide to change this blue to a different color, we have to modify only one place. And then everywhere in our application, all our components will automatically adopt the new color palette. So this is the benefit of using a theme. Now, earlier in this section, we imported a theme, a pre-built theme, but we can also create a custom theme that gives a unique character to our application. If you want to design a custom theme, the first step is to use the color tool on Material website. So head over to material.io/color. This is our color tool. So here on the left side, you can see a preview of your theme. Below that, we have primary and secondary. So currently I cannot select the secondary because we don't have a primary color yet. So as the primary color, I'm going to use blue. Let's scroll down. So here's blue. I'm going to pick this blue. Now on the left side, you can immediately see the impact of blue on our design. However, this user interface looks a little bit boring. It doesn't have any character because our button and slider are also blue. We want these items to stand out. That's why we use a secondary color to give them some accent. So I'm going to click here, and as the secondary color, I'm going to use yellow. So let's pick this yellow. Look, now we have some balance in the user interface. It's not too cold. We have some cool tones here and a warm tone. Also, you can navigate through different examples like this. Of course, this is for a mobile app, but it gives you an idea of what your theme looks like. Now, one thing I want you to pay attention to here is the number on top of this palette. So all these colors, as you can see, they have different versions, different shades. Starting from 50, we have the lightest shade, and 900 represents the darker shade. So the blue I have chosen here, that is our primary color. Look, let's see what is the shade of this blue. That is 600. So remember this number because later we're going to implement a custom theme, and there we want to reference exactly this kind of blue because all these colors are predefined in Material Design Guideline. These are not random numbers. They all have a name and a version. Now, before we get into the implementation of a custom theme, first we need to have an introduction to Sass, and that's the topic for the next lecture. If you have used CSS in a large, complex project, you know that CSS can quickly get hard to maintain. This is because the CSS that we use today lacks a lot of features. And this is where a CSS preprocessor can help. With a CSS preprocessor, we can use features that don't exist in CSS yet. So we write the CSS code of the future, and this preprocessor will then convert our code into valid CSS that browsers can understand today. This is exactly like how we use TypeScript to write JavaScript. So TypeScript, as you have seen in this course, has a lot of features that we don't currently have in JavaScript. So we write our code in TypeScript, and then our TypeScript compiler compiles, or more accurately, transpiles our TypeScript code into JavaScript. A CSS preprocessor is exactly the same. Now, there are various kinds of CSS preprocessors out there, and each support slightly different set of features. But more or less, they are the same. We've got Less, Sass, Stylus, and perhaps a few other preprocessors. Angular CLI by default supports Sass, which stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheet. So in this lecture, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to Sass and how to use it in an Angular application. Even if you are familiar with Sass, make sure to watch this lecture at least to learn how to use Sass in an Angular project. So, in the source folder, I'm going to create a new file and call it theme.sass. SCSS. So this is short for Sassy CSS, okay? Now we need to register this new file in Angular CLI configuration. So open up Angular CLI.json. And here in the styles array, add the path to our new Sass file, that is theme.scss. So this path is relative to the source folder. So here, both these files are located inside the source folder, okay? Now, to see Sass in action, first I'm gonna go to app.html and add a couple of headings. One is h1, let's say heading 1, and the other is h2, heading 2. Let's say we want both our headings to be blue. So in traditional CSS, this is how we implement that. We add h1, color blue, and h2, color blue. Now the problem with this implementation is that if in the future I decide to change blue to purple, then I have to modify two different places. Now there is a better way to write this. So now we only have to change one place. But what if h1 and h2 need different set of styles? Maybe we want more padding in our h1. So we can put all the shared styles here. Again, we need to separate them. So this approach, even though it works, it's not easy to maintain. And as your application grows, it becomes harder and more complex. So that's where Sass shines. With Sass, we can define variables and give them a value and then reuse that variable in multiple places. Exactly like how we have variables in JavaScript and TypeScript. So here I can define a variable with a $sign and call that color. Set it to blue. Now we can have two different set of rules for our h1 and h2, like this. Now here h1 can have a bunch of attributes, but it can also have color, and we set that color to this $color variable. Okay, and similarly we can use this color here. Now in the future, I can simply come back here and change this blue to green, and both these are automatically updated. Now back in the browser, we don't see our changes yet, because changes to Angular CLI are not visible unless you recompile your application. So back in the terminal, stop this, and one more, ng serve. And now both our headings are green. Beautiful. So this is how the magic happens. We give this Sass file to the Sass preprocessor, and Sass will replace this color variable with this actual value. So it's going to generate CSS like this. It's going to delete this and add green in these two places. Okay, so this is eventually what we give to the browser. Now let's revert this back. All right, so this is our original Sass file. Now let's take a look at another feature. Here we have this import statement, just like we have this in CSS. But the beautiful thing about this is that here we can import another Sass file. And when we give this theme.scss to Sass, Sass will import all the styles defined in another.scss and put them here, as if all of these were part of one file. So Sass is going to concatenate all of our Sass files into one file. So this is the import statement. Now let's take a look at another powerful feature called mixin. So I'm going to delete all this code. Define two classes, box. This box is going to have a border, 1 pixel, solid. And the border radius should be 5 pixel with a padding of 10 pixels. Now I'm going to have another class here. Let's call this modern box. I want this modern box to also have these 3 attributes, but perhaps with a few other attributes here. Now we can certainly use variables here, and instead of repeating these values, we can store them in 3 different variables. But again, we have to repeat these 3 attributes for each of these classes. To solve this problem, we use a mixin. A mixin is like a collection of multiple attributes. So we add @mixin, give it a name. Let's call this soft border. And now in curly braces, we add all the shared attributes. So I'm going to move all these here and delete them from here as well. Now we can reuse these attributes in various places by including our mixin. So here I add include. The name of our mixin is soft-border. And then we call it like a function. You may ask why? Because here we can also pass arguments to this function, and that's what I'm going to show you in a second. So let's include this in this modern box as well. So this is the benefit of a mixin. Now I told you that we can add arguments to a mixin. So here, let's say I want to be able to pass the border radius from the outside. So we add a parameter, just like how we had parameters to our functions in TypeScript. Let's call this border-radius. And then instead of hard coding 5 pixels here, we can add border radius. And then when calling this function, we pass an argument, 5 pixel. And perhaps here 10 pixel. So see, not only can we reuse certain attributes, but we also get the ability to make slight variations. So this was a very basic introduction to Sass. There is more to Sass than we can cover in this video, and that's something you need to learn on your own. But these 3 features that you learned in this lecture, that was variables, mixins, and imports, we're going to see them in the next lecture, where we define a custom theme for our application. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to create a custom theme. So back in our theme.scss file, on the top, first we need to import the Sass file that comes with Angular material. This Sass file defines all the colors that you saw earlier. So all those colors we saw in the color tool, they're all defined as variables here. It also includes a bunch of mixins, functions, and a few other things. So on the top, import. The address of this file relative to the node modules folder is ~@angular/material/_theming. Make sure to spell it properly, otherwise it's not going to work. And also, chances are in the future, the Angular material team may change the name of this file as they have done before. So if it doesn't work on your machine, let me show you how to find the path to the right file. So under node modules, under @angular, let's take a look. This is material folder. Here are our pre-built themes that we used earlier in the course. And this is our Sass file, theming.scss. I'm going to open this. So you can see there's several thousand lines of code here. Here we have a mixin, another mixin, and so much more code. So back to our theme.scss. We imported Angular material theme. Now we need to include the core styles that are defined in Angular material. These styles give our components a modern and consistent look and feel. For example, you have seen how our input fields look like, how our drop-down lists look like. All of these are defined in a mixin called mat-core. So to use that mixin here, we use include mat-core. Now to better understand this, let's go to Angular material theme file and search for mat-core. So we can see this is a mixin. Here we have a loop. And below that, we're including a few other mixins. So the first one is Angular material typography. This mixin defines all the styles for headings, paragraphs, and typography in general. So here we're including this mixin, and we're also including a few other mixins. Each mixin, as you saw earlier, brings in a bunch of CSS attributes and their values. So we included the core styles. Now we need to define our custom colors on top of these. So we need to define 3 variables for 3 color palettes: primary, accent, and warm. So to define a variable, use $sign. Let's give this a name like app-primary. Now here we want to call a function for generating a palette object. In Sass, function is similar to a mixin, but the difference is that a function can return a value. So here we have a function called mat-palette. We call this function and give it some arguments. Once again, to better understand what is happening under the hood, let's go back to the other Sass file and search for mat-palette. So you can see this is a function. It has a few parameters. The first parameter is base palette, and this is where we specify our color. So we pass a color here, like red, blue, green, whatever. And these additional arguments here, these are optional. As we can see, they have default values. So the second argument is default, which determines the average tone for that color. By default, it's set to 500. We can also specify the lighter and darker version of that color if we want to, but we don't have to. Now back here, our primary color was blue, as you saw in the color tool. So in this theme file, we have all the colors defined with a name like this. Mat dash, the name of the color. For example, blue. Once again, let's take a look at this variable. So back here, let's search for $mat dash blue. So this is the declaration of this variable. You can see it's a complex object. It has various properties. So these are different shades. And you can see the actual color code for that shade. Okay. So back to our theme file. We defined our primary palette by calling the mat-palette function. This function takes a color, in this case blue, and returns a palette object. Now, similarly, we're going to define a secondary palette. So app-accent. Again, we call mat-palette function. For our accent color, we're going to use yellow. So mat-yellow. Now here, for both these colors, I want to specify the exact shade that we found in the color tool. So the ones that I like are blue of 600 and yellow of 700. Now finally, we need to define another palette. So app-warn, we call the mat palette function, and we want to use red for our warnings. Okay, so these are our three color palettes. Now earlier I told you that a theme is a combination of multiple color palettes. So we need to define another variable and call it app theme. Now here we have two functions for creating a theme. We can use mat-light theme or mat-dark theme. Depending on which theme you use, the background and foreground colors are going to be different. And I'm going to show you how that works in a second. So let's go with the light theme. Once again, let's go have a look at this function. So search for mat-light theme. You can see this is a function with these parameters: primary, accent, and warn, which is optional because by default it's set to the red color palette. Okay, so back here, we need to pass our color palettes here. The first one is app-primary. The second one is app-accent. And finally, app-warn. Okay. Now we have a theme. Finally, we need to use a mixin to include this theme. So include, the mixin is angular-material-theme. And as an argument, we give it this theme object that is app-theme. Once again, you don't have to memorize any of these. You can simply go to Angular Material website and see this code on the documentation. But I wanted to explain it line by line so you know exactly how everything works. So let's see this in action. I'm going to go in app.component.html. I want to add a couple of buttons here. So button, I want them to be raised buttons. And let's call this button 1, duplicate to button 2. Now I want to give them different colors. So This one should be primary, and the other one should be accent. So this is where those colors come from our theme. Now let's see this in action. So you can see our buttons look different. So this is our light theme. Now let's take a look at a dark theme. So back in our custom theme file, I'm going to call matte dark theme function. Back in the browser, we don't see any changes because we need to apply a CSS class to the container of our application. This is where the background color is going to come into effect. So let's go to index.html. So this body element, this is the container of our application, right? So here we add a CSS class that is matte dash app dash background. Now back in the browser, this is our dark theme. So the background of our application is dark. So here in the template for app component, I've added a heading and a paragraph. With this markup, we get something like this. This font you see here is Times New Roman. What if you want to change the font, or the font size, or the font weight? This is what typography is all about. So let me show you how you can work with the typography in Angular Material. First, on Angular Material website, let's go to the guides. And here, let's click Using Angular Materials Typography. So here in this list, you can see a bunch of CSS classes that we can apply to various elements. So we've got title, subheading, body, caption, and so on. Now, in order for these to work, first we need to import the Roboto font that is used by Angular Material. Of course, we don't have to use this font. We can use a different font, but this is the standard look and feel of Angular Material. So on this page, you can see the link to Roboto font on Google. So I'm going to simply copy this URL. Now let's go to styles.css. On the top, I'm going to import this font. Okay. Now back in app component.html, we can apply those CSS classes you saw earlier on these elements. So on the paragraph, I can apply matte-body-1. So all these classes are prefixed with matte dash. Let's have a look. So now here we're using the Roboto font. Similarly, we can apply a class to our heading to replace the Times New Roman with the Roboto font. So here I'm going to apply matte dash headline. And with this is our new heading. Once again, you can see the list of all these CSS classes on this page. So we use the headline class with h1. Now, applying all these classes to individual elements is very tedious. So a better way is to apply it at a global level. So let's go to index.html. In the last lecture, we applied matte app background class to our body element. We have a similar class called matte-typography. With this class, we no longer have to apply individual classes to our headings, paragraphs, and other elements. So we can keep our code cleaner and we still get the same result. Now, what if you want to customize this font, or the font size, or the font weight? That's the topic for the next lecture. So in the last lecture, you learned how to use the typography in Angular Material. In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to customize this typography. So first, we want to replace the Roboto font with a different font. Let's go to fonts.google.com. Here I'm going to search for the Open Sans font. This is a very popular font that you have seen in a lot of websites out there. It's absolutely beautiful and modern. On this page, click this font and then click this icon here. So we selected the entire family of Open Sans. In your application, you may want to get a subset of the font instead of the entire font family. And this is purely for the optimization. But in this demo, it doesn't really matter. Now let's click on this black bar and then click on this icon. So here on this page, you can see how to use this font in your applications. So simply copy this URL. Now back in styles.css, I'm going to replace the Roboto font with this Open Sans font. So delete and then paste the address of the Open Sans font. Beautiful. Now we need to go to our custom theme and set this font as the new font. So what we're going to do is very similar to how we defined a custom theme. So to make this code a bit more readable, I'm going to add a comment here. Define a custom theme. So all these lines are about defining a custom theme, and then define custom typography. So I'm going to start by defining a variable called app-typography. And as the value, I'm going to call a function called mat-typography-config. Once again, to better understand this function, we can simply go to the Angular material theme file and search for this function. So look at the parameters of this function. We've got font family, which is by default set to Roboto. And then we have these labels here: display 4, 3, 2, 1, headline, title, subheading, body, and so on. These are the classes that you saw earlier in the typography documentation on Angular Material website. So if you want to further customize one of these classes, like title or body, then you need to pass additional arguments to this function. And if not, you can see all these have default values. As an example, look at the configuration of our headline. So here we have a call to mat typography level function, and these three arguments determine the font size, the line height, and the font weight. Now to customize the font, I'm going to pass this first argument here, font family. So back to our custom theme. Here I'm going to pass a few arguments. The first one is font-family, and I'm going to set this to Open Sans. And also, as a good practice, we should have fallback fonts. So if the client cannot download this Open Sans font, we should use fonts that are always available on various machines. For example, back in Angular Material theme, you can see after Roboto, we've got Helvetica Neue and Sans Serif. Helvetica Neue is available on pretty much all Macs out there, and Sans Serif is available on Windows machines. So we can simply copy this part from here and add it as fallback fonts in our font family. So if you want to change the font, that's all you have to do. Now later, I will show you how to customize the font size and font weight as well. So we have a new object here, app-typography. Now we need to use this custom typography object, exactly like how we defined a custom theme object here, and then we included that by calling this mixin. So very similar. Now we have a custom typography object, and to use it, we're going to include a predefined mixin that is Angular-material-typography. Look at the names. The mixin we used earlier was Angular Material Theme. The mixin we're using now is Angular Material Typography. And as the argument, we give it this app-typography object. So that's all we have to do. Now back in the browser. So what you see here is the Open Sans font. Now let me show you how to customize the heading. So here in mat typography config function, we can pass another argument. Let's go find the name of this argument. So back in the main theme, we have headline that is used for H1 elements. So I'm going to simply copy this line here, paste it, and change these arguments. So the first one is font size, the second one is line height, and the third one is font weight. So Let's make this font a little bit bigger. Let's say 35 pixels. And also I want to make it bold. 700. We don't need this comma here. And this is how we customize our headlines. And this is our new headline. So you can see it's really easy to customize the typography in Angular Material. We simply define a new typography object by calling mat typography config function, and then use this object by calling Angular Material typography mixin. Again, you don't have to memorize anything. All of this is documented on Angular Material website.